Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to New Books in Law, a podcast channel on the New Books Network. And I'm your host, Alex Batesmith. Today, I'm delighted that we'll be speaking to Chris Stephen about his recent book, The Future of War Crimes Justice. Chris is a highly experienced and much-travelled journalist who's reported from no less than 9 wars over the past 30 years for publications including The Guardian and the New York Times Magazine. As well as reporting from the front line, he has previously published a monograph on the trial of former Serbian leader Slobodan Milosevic. And what I'm particularly interested in talking to Chris about today is his unique perspective on war crimes justice as a journalist. And I guess for full disclosure, I've both a personal and a professional interest in this specific field, as in my previous life, I was a war crimes prosecutor myself, working in Kosovo and in Cambodia. And I have many friends who are journalists, and I've always enjoyed our conversations about our mutual field of interest from quite differing perspectives. So I'm sure we're going to have a fascinating conversation today. So Chris, welcome to New Books in Law.
Thank you.
Chris, I've given a very brief bio, but I wonder if you could begin by telling us a little more. What was your journey into journalism, and why have you spent so much time covering war and war crimes?
My journey into journalism, I think I sort of fell into it, really. And the big thing, I think, was just the excitement that when I left college, I thought, well, the most interesting job there is being a journalist, because the most interesting thing that happened in town today, whatever it happens to be, if you're the journalist, you're the one who's going to be covering it. And I think that's the case for a lot of journalists. I think people do fall into it rather than, having some long-term ambition. As to war, I've always been fascinated with wars. And I went out to Romania when the Iron Curtain fell in 1990 and just picked up the Guardian string because they were looking for somebody. And that's how I fell into being a foreign correspondent. And really since then, there's just been war after war. So I sort of became by default a war correspondent. And that's how I got to that.
Great. Okay, so let's get straight to your book, The Future of War Crimes Justice. Tell us a little about not just how, but why you came to write it as it is in its form.
Well, I think all war correspondents, we all want justice because we spend so much of our time on reporting on all these horrors. And when you're a war correspondent, you don't just meet the victims, you also meet the people doing it. And the back of your mind is always, I wish there was a way that these people could be accountable. And I got into war crimes because I was asked to be a witness in a case some years ago in Bosnia. Now, the case didn't really work out, but I did get this understanding and this excitement about the possibility of war crimes justice. So I wrote an earlier book about it on the Milosevic trial, but it was also on the creation of the war crimes courts. And I think one thing people perhaps now don't understand is how unlikely these courts were, that there's no plan for them in the UN Charter. They were never expected to happen. There's no structure. The UN just one day decided during the Bosnian War, we need to have a war crimes court. And it was brand new. The whole idea was brand new. But it's sort of got mushroomed from there, really.
So from specifying, focusing on this particular book on the Milosevic trial, you've written a book that's about war crimes trials in general. What was it about the generality rather than the specificity that you wanted to get across in your book?
Well, I wanted to look at really where it's going for 30 years down the line, particularly because the International Criminal Court has been, for many people, a great failure. It's been around for 20 years. It was supposed to continue the work of the United Nations courts, which had been so successful. But in 20 years, it's only jailed 5 war criminals. And if you look around the world, people are not frightened of war crimes courts. The war crimes go on. There's no sense of deterrence. So I wanted to look at has it still got a future, actually? But when I looked at it, I thought, well, war crimes justice does have a future. It's particularly in national courts. And even the International Criminal Court is not a total failure. So I wanted to try and draw these strands together. Because also, I think we're entering a period of great turbulence. And it's not really war crimes courts. It's really better to think of them as the worst crimes courts, because that's what they are. They are for the very worst crimes. And I think the need for it is becoming greater because the world is in such chaos.
That's a really interesting sort of introduction to the first question that I had, and it's quite a philosophical question, if you'll forgive me. I guess it's this: what do you mean by justice? To what extent do you think justice is a process? In other words, fair trials, irrespective of the outcome, regardless of whether the accused is found guilty or not guilty? Or to what extent do you think justice is an outcome? People who do bad things should be convicted and punished, almost regardless of the process. What's your take on justice as a whole?
Well, I got to throw it back to you because I think both the elements you've mentioned are part of it. But again, one of my mentors was the late John Jones, who was a marvelous barrister and one of the very first war crimes lawyers. And he said this thing. He said when they set up the very first UN court, the first problem they thought they would have is, how can you have a system of law for the whole world, for all the cultures, for Christians, for Muslims, for Jews, for Hindus, for people who have no religion, for every possible culture? And he said when they looked at it and they went through the rules and procedures, they realized that all the great religions and all the great cultures have the same standard of fairness, if you want to call it that, rather than justice, and that these laws are applicable to all cultures. And he said it was a slightly unexpected finding, but his view was that justice, excuse me, it's not so much a liberal concept, but the idea of fair play is really hardwired into us. And you see it all over the place. So this idea of unfairness, that something happened that shouldn't have happened, or that somebody got an unfair advantage. And I think that war crimes justice, it's just the one part of justice we don't already have. But if you do have fairness, and if you can bring it into a court or a parliament, then it doesn't go out on the streets or the battlefields. And that seems to be a good argument for having it.
I suppose we could spend the entire podcast debating that, but I want to get a bit more detail into the book. I've got one other preliminary question, I guess, and that's another term-defying question. Maybe a little unfair of a lawyer asking this question, but what do we mean by the term a war crime? What is a war crime?
No, it's a very fair thing, because these are not really war crimes courts. They are worst crimes courts, because crimes against humanity and genocide, they can happen whether there's a war on or not. We use war crimes because phonetically it sounds better. It's just easier to say. It just sounds more powerful to say war crimes. If I say worst crimes, it just doesn't scan well. And I'm not the first to come up with this, because if you think about Raphael Lemkin, who invented the Genocide Convention, he invented the word because there was no word for genocide. The only one he could find was a German compound word that went on forever. So he thought, we need a word that's catchy, and he combined half of Geno, if I got it right, is Greek for people, and then side is Latin for killing, people killing, which sounds ridiculous as a compound, but when you match it as genocide, it becomes this very powerful word. And I think it's the same with war crimes, that it's really the very worst things that we can do to each other. And if I can, a very small anecdote, I said to these lawyers the other day, you can imagine an alien coming down to Earth and lands in London, and he's looking for a place to land, and he sees this green thing, great. So he puts his saucer down, and it's the Lincoln's Inn Field, and that's where he chosen. And all these lawyers come running out, and the alien, luckily, speaks English. And he says, well, show me your civilization. So they said, you come to the right place, right? So they take him to all the law courts, and they take him to the Old Bailey, they take him to the libraries, and he's so impressed. He's like, oh my goodness, you've got all this law, all these lawyers you have on tax evasion or parking or contract law, libraries and libraries and libraries of laws. It's absolutely fantastic. And there's 20,000 of you guys. And then the alien says, and what do you do for the worst crimes? And they say, what do you mean? Well, what about when it's not tax or parking or contract or even murder and burglary? What about if I kill 1 million people? And they say, well, we don't really do those crimes. There's a place in The Hague where no one really thinks about it, but there's not much. And the alien, he can't understand this. He's like, but these are the worst possible things, and you're telling me that there's one little court and a very few books and a tiny library. How is that possible? And that, in a long way, is sort of the contradiction that I'm trying to address. Why do we ignore the very worst things that we do to each other?
Well, that's one of the questions that I hope we're going to be discussing in a couple of questions' time. I'll
Okay.
put the readers on ice, the listeners on ice for that a second. But maybe we should also set a little historical context for the listeners, starting with Nuremberg, how and where these core international crimes, you've mentioned genocide, you've mentioned crimes against humanity, there's war crimes, which is a specific term of art as well, and the fourth of these four core international crimes is aggression. So starting with Nuremberg, how have these crimes been investigated? What courts have they been prosecuted, as you discuss in the book?
Okay, well, the thing my book focuses on, maybe an exciting thing, is that the laws have been around for ages and ages and ages. The two big ones are the Hague laws and the Geneva laws. And the Geneva Conventions, 1864, and the law that the Hague was based on was 1863. In those 2 years, the meat and potatoes of modern war crimes law was created, all in that 18-month period. And then basically nothing was done. After World War II came the Genocide Convention. So you had Hague, genocide, Geneva, then you had torture. And again, nothing was ever done. And then suddenly people decided, well, we'll do something. And as you say, the first thing was really Nuremberg and Toyko. And it wasn't the first time they'd ever tried war crimes, but they are, I would say, the first time was actually a recognizable war crimes trials. But after that, the Allies said, let's close the book on that. We don't want any more of this kind of thing. And then nothing really happened, except that more and more of these conventions were signed. The Torture Convention, the Helsinki Final Act. These things rolled on and on and on. And all the dictatorships of the world, they would sign these things because they think it doesn't really matter, right? Nothing's ever going to happen. And then suddenly, 1993, crash, bang, wallop, the UN creates a war crimes court. And this gets this momentum because having created one for Bosnia in 93, when the Rwanda genocide happened a year later, they felt obliged to create another one. They didn't want to, but they had to. And then every time there was a war, they created another one. Cambodia, Sierra Leone, East Timor. And some of these were UN, the hybrids, there were different arrangements. But then out of that came the International Criminal Court. But meanwhile, all the national courts, prosecutors, started to look at all these laws and think, why don't we do the same thing? Because this law has been lying around. And, the big one that comes to mind is General Pinochet. So Pinochet was this Chilean general. He took power in a very bloody, very brutal coup in 1979, 69, a long time ago. And he then traveled to England regularly for medical treatment. And a Spanish prosecutor realized that he could be indicted for a number of crimes because under Spanish law, if you harm a Spanish citizen outside of Spain, that's a crime. And also he realized that he could indict him under the Torture Convention because Chile had signed the Torture Convention. And if you sign one of these things, people don't really understand that it doesn't just allow other people to try you for it. It says that we agree to be tried for it. If I commit torture and I go to Germany, I agree because I've signed this Torture Convention that the Germans can put me on trial. Now, for Pinochet, it was a massive shock when on a Friday night, the British police come into his hospital and they say, we're arresting you. We're not arresting you for a British crime. We're arresting you on a Spanish warrant for a case in Chile. And he was, at first he thought they were joking. And it was a shock to him. It was a shock, a surprise, around the world that a person could be arrested by a police force in one country for crimes committed in a second country on a warrant issued by a third country. And I think that shows the power of all these laws when you decide you want to do something about them. And what you've seen since then has been more and more and more cases in which national prosecutors have looked through the files and thought, aha, look at all this stuff. We could actually make cases. And now you have hundreds of these cases going on. And that, badly put, is kind of the modern history of war crimes law.
Great, thank you. That really sets it up. I guess leading on from that, I wanted to start with the first section or the first substantive chapter in the book where you talk about what's happening in Ukraine and the almost certain unlikelihood of Vladimir Putin being tried for war crimes or crimes against humanity. And in this discussion, you highlight, I guess, the principal weakness of war crimes justice, that rule of law gives way to might is right in virtually all scenarios. Can you tell us a bit about this inherent weakness at the heart of war crimes justice? It may be in the context of Putin or the current and future indictments against him or anyone else currently at the top of a military, a nuclear armed superpower.
Yeah, I think it comes down to the fact that laws they don't come out of the sky. A law is a made up thing that we make them up because we think it's better. If somebody takes your stuff, I'd rather we have a court that can decide than you just go out and try and take their stuff or some brutality. So that's why we have it. That's why we have law instead of might is right. But it's very conditional, and it does depend on us. And I think often people talk about the law in sort of hushed tones as a reverential thing. It's not. It's a set of rules. And we make these rules because it's so much easier. It's so much less bloody and brutal to use a law if everyone agrees to that law. But what if everyone doesn't agree to that law? And that's the thing you highlight with Putin. Russia's not a member of the ICC, but he invaded Ukraine and all these terrible things happened. And the ICC, to be fair to the ICC, is saying, look, we are only an extension of Ukraine. If you go to a country and you do murder, then you're going to be indicted by that country, even if you're not from that country. If I go to America and smash up a shop, they're going to put me in jail. I can't say, well, look, I'm British. You can't indict me. Yes, I can. Well, it's the same for the ICC. But it does depend on how much we want this thing to really work. Now, with the ICC, some countries are members, some are not. Russia is not. Lots of other countries are not, because they don't want that. They would rather have might is right. And that's really the tension. And that's why, even though he's indicted, it's hard to see how he'd ever be handed over.
And there's no system of enforcement of this global system of justice we call international criminal law or war crimes justice.
And that was actually the first prosecutor of the first court, Richard Goldstone, actually said, he said, the international community are my arms and legs. He said, without them, he said, I'm nothing. I'm a guy in an office in a city in Holland with a dozen lawyers. I can't force a Serbian warlord to come to this trial. I can issue an indictment, but it depends on you lot to make it happen.
One of the major criticisms of war crimes trials, I guess, has been the sense that the winners get to say who's going to be put on trial.
Yeah.
And nowhere was this seen more starkly than at the very genesis of international criminal law, war crimes justice in Nuremberg and in Tokyo after the end of the Second World War. I wonder if you could reflect a little about how far, if at all, you think we've come from that position of victor's justice at the end of the Second World War to where we are now.
I think we've come kicking and screaming further from that position, further towards justice. But I in the book, I try to highlight that the permanent tension between any government of whatever stripe and justice, that they instinctively don't like it. They fear it. They don't want to give a political power to a judge. But at the same time, in democracies, they know that justice is seen as inherently a good thing. And that's for the left, for the right, for everybody. The voters think it's a good thing. So they don't want to say no, but they don't want to say yes. And that's, in a way, that's the best way of understanding the slightly chaotic way that it's advanced. But yes, it has advanced because, as you say, Nuremberg Tokyo was a straight victor's thing. And it was fair enough in those terms, but only the bad guys were going to be indicted. The fact that it's changed, I mean, it's really been, I would say, it's been a guerrilla campaign by lawyers, actually, who wanted to make it work. And there's a guy called Jim O'Brien, who was the American, he was a State Department guy. He just started out, he was like in his 20s, when the Americans decided they needed evidence to support the very first Hague tribunal. And he's an extraordinary guy because he was a young buck. He was in this office doing war crimes, and it was a tiny thing. This is before there were war crimes courts. It was just him. And it was all sort of American soldiers in trouble in a base in Okinawa or something. It was all, And then one day he gets a call from the State Department, from the boss, saying, right, look, we're going to form a war crimes court. And the UN is. And he's like, oh, that's fantastic. He says, yeah, and we need evidence. Eagleberger, I think it was the Secretary of State, has got to present to the UN in 2 months' time a dossier showing why we need this court. And O'Brien's like, that's fantastic. He says, yeah, and you've got to do the dossier. He says, what do you mean? It's just me, that's it. They said, well, you better do it, buddy, otherwise your ass is grass. He can't go into the UN Security Council without this dossier. You have to produce it. And O'Brien's like, but this is just me. I don't know. There's no secretary. There's no staff. And they said to him, there is one good thing about this mission. Everyone has to jump to it. All right. You can phone Department of Defense, CIA, Justice, FBI, anybody you want. And if they obstruct or delay, you can say, I'm going to complain to the White House, basically. You've got that kind of power. And he said it was amazing. I'm a 21-year-old guy. I'm phoning up the chief of the Pentagon and demanding shit and stuff. And it's coming down the line to me. And he said he was really high on it. But he also said this other thing to me. He said he realized early on the government didn't actually want to do this. He said to me, governments don't want to do war crimes justice, but they have to be seen to want it. All right. So they're looking, he realized for that presentation, and then afterwards he became the American kind of liaison for this. They're always looking for a reason to say no. What they want to do is you want to go into a meeting and they want to say, Jim, fantastic, it's great that you care so much, and we care, we really do. But on page 96, this thing is just not going to fly. So he said, you've got to be able to answer that question on page 96, all right? And the way he put it was, he said, you've got to put a government in a position where it has to say no. And he said, nobody wants to say no to war crimes justice. And he said, you look at all the pioneers, all the first prosecutors, they're all the same. They work their socks off to make sure that when they go into that room, the minister can't say, I'd love to, but. You've got to be able to say, no, there's no but, Mr. Minister. Look, I've answered every possible question. And I think that's why it is where it is today. I think it's actually as simple as that.
I keep saying this, I know, but I want to preserve some flow to the questions, but I will. No, not at all. I will come back to America. It's one of my penultimate questions. But before I get there, there's a little bit more groundwork to be done, I think, and that's to talk a bit more about the ICC, the International Criminal Court in The Hague, because obviously, for listeners, obviously this is the first permanent international criminal court, in contrast to the ad hoc tribunals that have been set up by the United Nations or by a combination with UN agreements and national government agreements. It's the first ever permanent court in The Hague. Tell us a bit about what you write in the book about this being a members club. What do you mean by that? What are the limitations of the ICC? And also maybe what are the strengths of the ICC in The Hague?
Yeah, so I try to use non-legal language because I think war crimes law is never going to work unless ordinary people understand it. It's just not going to fly because ordinary people understand why you need regular law to govern them, but they don't understand why you need a law for another country far away. And that's why I try to use these words. And so what the International Criminal Court is a club. It's not universal. It's not part of the United Nations. It's 124 countries have all signed this treaty. And it says two things. It says, number one, anything that we do wrong, this court can now judge us. And it also says that we make the rules. We're the boss. It has 124 bosses. And you'd think, well, that's very strong. Well, actually, no, it's actually very weak because it means they can all hide behind each other. And I think it's become like any organization that doesn't have strong leadership. And that's why it's not really being very effective and it's all over the place and there's all sorts of different judgments. It's not really the fault of the people there. It's because there's no direction. And again, I'm sorry if I'm going off the subject, but that's why I think, my personal opinion, it did so much worse than the United Nations courts that came before, because the United Nations courts were set up by the UN Security Council, and the 5 permanent members, that's Britain, France, America, China, Russia, they're not noted for their love of human rights, but when they do something, they expect it to be done, because if it's not done, it makes them look stupid and humiliates them. So when they set up these courts, they said, make it work. And there was this pressure on prosecutors, on judges, on presidents. They had to make it happen. And they had to report back to the Security Council. I think it was every quarter. And if they couldn't produce results, they were in trouble. Now, the ICC doesn't have anything like that. There's no reporting back. They have the states meet once a year for this sort of jamboree, but there's never any pressure. You never see a prime minister or a foreign minister saying, "Oh, I'm really upset that the ICC didn't do this or doing that." So that's why it just sort of wanders along, and I think that's a great shame.
Is there a way to correct it specifically? We're going to come to some of the specifics about corporations and prosecuting corporations in a couple of questions' time, but are there fundamental structural issues that need to be changed, do you think, in your view, for the ICC to work more effectively?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't think an organization without leadership can work. I think by design, it won't work. Well, it'll work. You can't say it doesn't work. It's just extremely inefficient. But if you were going to change something, you need to have direction. You'd need to have the 124 saying, okay, we'll have a council of a dozen nations, like you do with the UN Security Council, right? You have like a dozen or 10 or whatever, and they'll meet 4 times a year, and they'll have some rules. They'll say to the prosecutor, you have to do this and this and this. Like if you're going to prosecute, you have to explain why it's taken 10 years for one case and 3 months for another. You have to go for the most serious or whatever it happens to be, and you've got to come to us at least twice a year and explain what's going on. I think that would be a major change, but I just don't see it happening, because I think the more countries join it, the more unwieldy it gets. So I don't think it will not do anything at all, but I think it's always going to be handicapped.
Let's talk a bit about the people, because as you said, laws don't just miraculously appear. They're made by men and women. And in the book, you talk about how war crimes courts, to quote you, draw on the idealistic sentiments of their lawyers. And you were talking about how in the early days of the war crimes trials, it was common, as you say, for leading criminal lawyers to volunteer for stretches at the tribunals to help justice, according to fans, to win fame, according to their critics. So where are we now? Is there still a place for idealism, or is it just all hubris?
No, I think there is a place for idealism. And, I don't want to get tracked down, sort of sidetracked in the argument, is there such a thing as altruism? I mean, maybe there is, maybe there isn't. But it's certainly the case that it touches something very deeply in lawyers, this war crimes justice. And just to give a funny story, I was at the annual International Bar Conference, was in Paris last November, and they had these 2 speeches, but sort of speeches, they were sort of interviews. One was with the Ukrainian chief prosecutor, and then there was one with Karim Khan, the ICC chief prosecutor. Now, this conference is enormous. There's 6,000 lawyers. It's held in a place, it's as big as Wembley Conference Centre. It's absolutely massive. And they needed the biggest possible hall for each of these events. And it was standing room only. You jam in. It was both were absolutely packed out. And one of them said to me, he was like a French tax lawyer. He said, look, we also have tax symposiums. But believe me, Chris, we don't hold them in a gigantic hall. And he said, there's lawyers from every kind of branch of the law at this conference who've come along to the war crimes bit. It's the one bit that is, I don't know, sexy or exciting or thrilling, or even that you don't like it, but it's the one thing that really got them, that really touched something in them. And it made me think, as a non-lawyer, but as I have lawyers in the family, whether there's a side of you, if you study law, that you do have this intrinsic sense of wanting to right wrongs. If that answers the question.
It does. It sort of makes me think of a piece I published a few years ago. This isn't meant to be about me, obviously, but I had a piece on cause lawyering in international criminal justice, and something that you said there sort of really chimes with some of the things that I found as a war crimes prosecutor, and seeing how much meaning people get out of their jobs. I mean, that could be for good or for ill. It can really drive on motivation, but it can also lead to perhaps a blindness or perhaps a lack of balance or a sense of hubris that might actually obscure the realities. But that's for a different podcast, maybe. So back to the scripts, I guess. There's a really interesting passage in your book where you look at forensic psychiatric evidence regarding what makes a war criminal from different countries. I'm interested in asking you, to what extent do you think war crimes justice can, whether through the mere issuing of an indictment against or the actual conviction and punishment of a suspect, whether it can actually prevent or deter future commission by other people, either in the same or different countries, of war crimes?
Yeah, I mean, I did. I sort of poked around on this psychology because I thought, well, the future of war crimes justice, I have to look beyond just the legal. I mean, who are the people committing crimes and how can they be stopped? Because that's the end product. That's why we have it. I've forgotten the question.
What do you think war crimes can be deterred or prevented by the indicting or the convicting of other war criminals?
I think it can, but I think you need to talk to other less optimistic people than me, because I think it can. I mean, my first job in journalism was a court reporter, and I mean, I remember going to these magistrates' courts and coroners' courts, and officials would say to me, "Look, we're not going to end crime. That's not why a lawyer becomes a barrister. That's not why a person becomes a policeman. They don't think at the end of their life, there's as much crime in London as there was when I started. They think of it as cutting hair. Your hair keeps growing. You have to keep cutting it." But I think that is a realistic goal. And I think the evidence for deterrence is very small. But I think it is there. And I think, for instance, if you look at Gaza, now you could say, look, there's terrible things going on, October the 7th and since. But both sides are very conscious of the role of international law and keep having to justify themselves. Now, you could say, well, so what? Bad stuff happens. But it might be worse if there wasn't this law. And I think that's the hardest thing for war crimes justice, because it's never going... there's not binary. You never see a street protest for war crimes justice, right? You never see people saying, lower the body count now, right? But that is its tremendous weakness. That how can it say it's working? The only one thing that jumps out at me is in the Kosovo War, there was a Serbian warlord called Arkan. Now, he'd done terrible things in Bosnia, and I'd actually met him a couple of times and written about him. And when the war started, I was down in Kosovo, but on TV, on CNN, he gave this interview in Belgrade to this, I think it was CNN, or it might have been NBC. Anyway, he asked them for the interview, and they were really surprised. And he sort of rattled on about how, I don't believe in war crimes. But the significant thing was he was showing that he wasn't in Kosovo because he was frightened of being indicted. And I think that is one of the few really solid things that you could see where it does deter, where you could say, well, if it wasn't for that, of course he'd be in Kosovo. I mean, he loves the idea of all this mayhem. I think it's best to think of war crimes justice in the same way as regular justice, because it works or fails for the same reasons. And looking at the psychology of people, it's the same thing. You talk to a policeman, he'll say, yes, a lot of people, when you show them that something's wrong, or you show how the victim suffers, they'll say, oh yeah, that was awful. But he said a lot of people won't. A lot of people will commit crimes, unless you have a big stick. And I think it's the same for war crimes justice. I think there has to be this big stick, and it has to be credible for it to work.
Let's move on. I was going to ask you about something that's also at the heart of your book, about the necessity of not simply prosecuting the senior military or civilian leaders, but also the businesses and corporate entities that bankroll war. Tell us a little bit more about that. Do you feel that there's been any progress, any recent successes? What is the future of prosecuting corporate entities for their complicity in war crimes?
Yeah, this is the thing I really got interested in, because when I got the commission for this book, I was very excited. And I woke up the next morning and I thought, I have no idea what the future of war crimes law is going to be. I know the various permutations, but I have no idea what's going to happen. And I looked around and I thought, well, where's the growth area? And I thought, well, the only real growth area is corporate war crimes, because if you look around the world, most of the crimes are for material now, for resources. And it's the people buying the resources are the reasons why these crimes are committed. And there have been sporadic efforts, which luckily for my book, I just got going as I started to write the book. In Sweden, there's the very first trial in history, war crimes trial, of an oil company. And it's taken 20-something years to get this thing going, but it's going. It's a criminal trial. These two guys will go to jail if they're found guilty, and they're pleading not guilty. And, I don't know which way the trial's going to go, but now there's trials in the Netherlands. There's a new prosecutor in Switzerland who's saying, I'm going to go after all kinds of companies, because almost every corrupt company in the world has some sort of registration in Switzerland. You have France has 14 of these corporate war crimes trials. And I think it's an enormous growth area, particularly because corporations all watch each other in a way that warlords, terrorists, and dictators don't. Warlords just do what they do. They don't all read the Financial Times. There isn't a Warlord Times or something. But corporations, they all watch each other. And you can bet they're all looking around and looking at London or looking at Switzerland, looking at the Lafarge case that happened in America. And they're thinking, that could be me. And they're thinking, these cases are not against the corporation. It's not BP getting a huge fine for the Gulf of Mexico oil spill. It's me personally. You're the director. You ordered this, and you're going to go to jail. All right. And there's one thing that late middle-aged directors all want, which is time. Because they've got a family, they have a villa, they've got a nice life, but they're in their 50s or 60s. They don't want to spend the next 10 years in jail. They fear that. They do fear shareholders and blah, blah, and fines. But the idea that you'd actually go to jail, I think has a massive effect. And I think it is growing really fast. And I think for these reasons, that it's such a powerful thing. Because if these corporations did behave themselves, it takes away the incentive for a whole rash of war crimes going on all over the world.